On Wednesday afternoon, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer testified before Congress, and his remarks were quickly circulated. His testimony was widely viewed as Washington's opening move in the process of reviewing QSME, scheduled to begin next year. In his presentation, Greer identified 3 Canadian policies that the United States considers obstructive: barriers to the dairy market, legislation affecting online platforms such as Netflix and YouTube, and decisions by certain Canadian provinces to remove American alcohol from store shelves. What stood out, however, was the particular emphasis Greer placed on dairy. This issue was not treated as merely one concern among many. Instead, he framed expanded access to Canada's dairy market as a core condition for any successful QSMA negotiations. According to his argument, Canada continues to uphold policies that Washington views as unfairly restricting market access for U.S. dairy products. The U.S. dairy lobbying industry has been preparing for this moment for a long time. During President Trump's first term, it secured tariff-free access to roughly 3.5% of Canada's dairy market. Clearly, however, that is no longer the extent of its ambitions. Their goals now go much further. Specific complaints center on how Ottawa allocates existing import quotas, as well as allegations that Canadian producers are selling concentrated milk on international markets at prices viewed as dumping. These are not exploratory arguments or polite gestures at the negotiating table. Taken together, they amount to a clear message from Washington. Dismantling Canada's supply management system is being placed on the table as a precondition for continued U.S. engagement within the framework of continental trade. On Thursday morning, Mark Carney appeared before the media alongside Ontario Premier Doug Ford. The question was asked in English. Carney chose to respond in French. That decision was anything but accidental. It was a deliberate communication signal aimed squarely at Quebec, where supply management is not merely an agricultural policy tool, but part of cultural identity and a pillar of economic security. For those who may not have followed every detail, the sequence of events can be summarized as follows. Carney did not engage directly with Washington's arguments, nor did he acknowledge that U.S. demands represented legitimate grievances requiring Canadian concessions. Instead, he reaffirmed Canada's policy as a proven reality, and then deliberately moved on to another subject. This is a textbook example of how sovereignty is defended. When an external actor demands that you justify or explain domestic policies built over more than half a century in Canada's own interest, entering into debate is unnecessary. All that is required is to restate your position and steer the conversation toward the boundaries Canada is prepared to accept. Ladies and gentlemen, between Wednesday afternoon and Thursday morning, North American trade relations witnessed a rare development. Washington moved to place issues on the negotiating table that it believed still left room for compromise. Ottawa responded with a firm refusal, and with careful preparation, Canada demonstrated why U.S. pressure strategies often fail when confronted by governments that clearly understand their own position and leverage. Supply management is not a dry technical concept confined to agricultural circles. It is a policy system built in the 1970s to maintain stable and predictable prices by guaranteeing minimum incomes for farmers producing dairy, poultry, and eggs. In the eyes of U.S. trade negotiators, this mechanism is seen as distorting markets and unfairly restricting American producers' access to Canadian consumers. But for Canadian policymakers, particularly in Quebec, where dairy farming is deeply woven into rural life, it stands as a symbol of food security and a foundation of economic stability for farming communities. It is precisely at this point that Mark Carney's position reveals its strategic sharpness. He is not defending the supply management system simply because of pressure from agricultural interest groups. He is defending it because any concession on core domestic policies to satisfy U.S. trade demands would set a dangerous precedent, one that would erode Canada's sovereignty in every subsequent round of negotiations. If Ottawa were to retreat on supply management merely to preserve broader market access, what would prevent Washington in the future from demanding that Canada adjust its environmental regulations, its healthcare system, or its resource management policies? When this dairy dispute is placed within the broader context of continental relations, what is truly unfolding becomes clearer. The clash over supply management reflects a deeper shift in how Canada responds to economic pressure from the United States. It is worth recalling that beyond dairy, Jamieson Greer also referenced legislation governing online platforms and provincial measures restricting alcohol. Washington is expecting compliance on multiple fronts simultaneously. Regulations governing digital platforms require Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube to contribute to Canadian content production, reflecting a determination to protect cultural sovereignty in the digital space. Meanwhile, provincial alcohol policies demonstrate federalism operating as intended under the Constitution, with local governments exercising their authority over commerce within their jurisdictions. Washington views all three of these issues as protectionist barriers that unfairly restrict U.S. businesses. Ottawa, by contrast, regards them as legitimate domestic policies designed to serve the national interest. This difference is not merely semantic, it is fundamental, and Carney's refusal to accept the U.S. interpretation of supply management sends a clearer signal than any statement could. Canada will no longer shape its domestic policies around Washington's trade priorities. The story becomes even more striking at this point. Mark Carney stated on Thursday that Canada and the United States had come very close to reaching an agreement before the negotiating process unexpectedly collapsed in late October. What caused that breakdown? An advertisement commissioned by the Ontario government under Doug Ford, which quoted former U.S. President Ronald Reagan in criticism of tariff policy. According to Carney, it was this very advertisement that prompted Donald Trump to terminate the negotiations at the end of October. Pause and reflect on that for a moment. Washington suspended bilateral talks simply because a Canadian province aired an advertisement quoting the words of a former American president on tariffs. At Thursday's press conference, standing alongside Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Carney was asked directly about the interruption of the negotiations. His response was cautious, but revealing. He confirmed that the process had indeed been halted, acknowledged that the two sides had been very close to an agreement, and described the breakdown as regrettable but not beyond repair. Carney also left the door open to renewed dialogue on the condition that Washington approach any future negotiations with seriousness. Canada is prepared to negotiate in good faith, but it will not adjust its domestic political discourse simply to accommodate the personal sensitivities of the President of the United States. Tracing the chain of events that led to the current standoff provides further clarity. During Donald Trump's first term, bilateral negotiations resulted in limited concessions in the dairy sector, allowing U.S. imports tariff-free access to roughly 3.5% of the Canadian market. From Canada's perspective, negotiators have always regarded that figure as a firm ceiling, not a starting point for expanding U.S. dairy access. Under the Joe Biden administration, U.S. dairy lobby groups intensified their pressure, repeatedly calling for expanded quotas, arguing that existing access was insufficient and raising concerns about Canada's exports of dairy protein to international markets. As Mark Carney's government entered the spring election campaign, Ottawa sent an unmistakable message. The supply management system was not up for negotiation. This message was reinforced in particular with agricultural communities in Quebec. By October, matters had become tangled. Trade talks abruptly collapsed after the Ontario government under Doug Ford aired a controversial advertisement. According to Carney, prior to that moment, the two sides had in fact been very close to reaching a more comprehensive agreement. By December, as the Customer Review entered its final stage, Jameson Greer publicly asserted that expanded access to Canada's dairy market was a precondition for the negotiations to succeed. Ottawa responded with a firm refusal in less than 24 hours. This sequence of events is striking. Each time Washington escalated pressure, Canada's response became more resolute. Every attempt to turn supply management into a negotiable issue was met with a renewed affirmation of position. Escalating pressure did not produce concessions. It simply clarified the boundaries Canada is prepared to defend. This was not passive defense, but a deliberate strategy of setting limits. By consistently reiterating its stance at every flashpoint, Carney's team has been clearly defining the scope of Canada's negotiating flexibility. It was precisely this calculation that Washington misread from the outset. The United States assumed that Canada's smaller economic size would ultimately force Ottawa to retreat on core domestic policies in order to preserve market access. That assumption reflects a familiar view of the continental balance of power. The U.S. absorbs roughly 75% of Canada's total exports, and by that logic, this level of dependence was seen as sufficient leverage to override any Canadian resistance to specific policy demands. Mark Carney's government, however, operates on a very different set of assumptions. Ottawa fully understands the importance of the U.S. market, but it also recognizes that Canada controls resources, transportation corridors, and regulatory frameworks that American businesses depend on to operate. More importantly, it recognizes that conceding foundational domestic policies would not deliver long-term trade stability. Such concessions would establish a dangerous precedent, granting the United States something close to an open-ended veto over Canadian government decision-making. For that reason, when Jamieson Greer framed dairy market access as a key condition for the success of Cosmotalks, Ottawa heard a deeply contradictory message. If Washington defines success as Canada dismantling agricultural frameworks that have existed for more than half a century, it is Washington itself that renders an agreement unattainable. Carney's response, that supply management is not on the agenda, full stop, was not a declaration of the end of negotiations. It was a way of redirecting discussions toward areas where Canada genuinely has room for flexibility. The formal CUSMA review process will begin next year, at which point the three countries will assess whether to extend the agreement beyond its 2036 expiry. This review will encompass issues of dairy market access,